Officer Ronald Green sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers against the wheel. Another dull night shift in Richmond, Virginia, nothing but empty streets and flickering streetlights. The boarded-up liquor store down the block had been closed for years, and the cracked sidewalks told a story of neglect. To Ronald, this part of town had long since given up, and in return he had stopped expecting anything different. Then movement. A lone figure shuffled down the sidewalk. A woman, frail and slow, gripping a plastic bag in one hand and a cane in the other. She wore an oversized coat, the brim of her hat shadowing her face. Too old, too fragile. What was she doing out here? At this hour, Ronald narrowed his eyes. Something felt off. He had learned to trust his instincts, and his gut told him she didn't belong. Was she lost? Homeless? Up to something worse? He eased his squad car to the curb, keeping the engine running. His eyes never left her. She wasn't breaking any laws, but that didn't matter. Suspicion was enough. He stepped out of the car, the weight of the badge pressing against his chest. Authority surged through him. He thrived on moments like these, the rush of control, the unchallenged power. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice sharp in the quiet street. The woman didn't startle. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she turned slowly, lifting her head, just enough for him to glimpse the deep-set wisdom in her eyes. Then, without urgency, she reached into her coat and pulled out a badge. An FBI badge. Ronald's breath caught. Under the dim glow of the streetlights, Ronald's boots struck the pavement with purpose, breaking the silence of the empty street. The woman ahead of him didn't react. She didn't flinch or quicken her steps like others did when they saw an officer approaching. Her calmness unsettled him, not fitting the familiar script where people in this neighborhood knew to lower their heads, avoid eye contact, and move along. This defiance, subtle yet deliberate, irritated him in a way he couldn't quite explain. The weight of authority settled over him as he closed the distance, his presence meant to be an unspoken warning. He scrutinized her, noting the frailty in her posture, the slow but steady grip on her cane, the way her worn coat hung loosely around her. Up close, she looked even older than he had first assumed, her skin lined with years of hardship. His gaze flicked to the plastic bag in her hand, suspicion creeping into his thoughts. Something about her didn't sit right. The late hour, the deserted streets, the way she simply existed without fear in a place that should have demanded it. She finally turned to face him, her expression as still as the air between them. There was something unsettling about her lack of reaction, the way she held herself with quiet resolve. His instincts had been honed over years of patrol, trained to detect deception, to uncover the hidden threats beneath seemingly ordinary moments. He didn't trust this stillness, this unshaken presence in the face of his authority. He had encountered too many who thought they could outmaneuver him, who believed they were smarter than the law. Her composure, her unwillingness to shrink, pressed against his nerves like a challenge. He needed to tip the balance, to remind her of who was in control. His demand came sharp and immediate, an assertion of dominance. Without hesitation, she revealed the contents of her bag: bread, milk, canned soup. It was nothing. A simple answer to a question he had expected to lead somewhere else. The absence of anything suspicious left him dissatisfied, a hollow space where his assumptions had been waiting to take hold. He wasn't ready to let go, wasn't willing to accept that there was nothing more to uncover. The street was silent, the night air thick with tension. The woman's words lingered in the space between them, steady and deliberate, carrying an edge that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Standing outside a store wasn't a crime, and yet, the way she said it, so calm, so certain, made it feel like a challenge. There was something in her tone, in the unwavering way she met his gaze, that crawled under his skin like an itch he couldn't scratch. He stepped closer, too close, his chest nearly brushing against hers. His pulse pounded, his breath hot and ragged, his restraint hanging by a thread. She had done nothing but exist, yet somehow she had stripped him of the control he thrived on. He couldn't accept that. He couldn't let her stand there, looking through him as if she saw something deeper than he wanted to admit. His grip tightened around her arm, fingers pressing into fragile skin. He expected a reaction, a flinch, a plea, anything that would put him back in control, but she only looked down at his hand, then back up, her expression unchanged. The same unbearable calm, the same quiet defiance. Her voice remained steady as she told him to let go. He didn't. Instead, the frustration surged, twisting into something more dangerous. She was supposed to be afraid. She was supposed to lower her gaze, to obey, to play the role he had assigned her in his mind. But she wouldn't. How dare she stand there as if his presence meant nothing, as if he was the one on trial. His grip tightened further, his body rigid with unspoken rage. He told himself he needed to regain control, needed to remind her of who held the power here. But then she spoke again, her voice quiet, cutting through. The silence like a blade. This wasn't about her, it was about him. The words struck deeper than he was prepared for. A flicker of something foreign, something unfamiliar, cracked through the carefully constructed armor he had spent years building. Doubt. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he hesitated. And in that hesitation, something inside him slipped. His muscles tensed, his vision narrowed, and before he could stop himself, his hand moved. The impact was sharp, sudden. A flash of motion, a collision of skin and bone. The force of his fist sent her stumbling back, her cane clattering to the ground, groceries spilling from the torn bag, cans rolling aimlessly into the gutter. The moment stretched, the world shrinking to the single breath of silence that followed. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She only wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth and slowly, deliberately, pushed herself back up. For the first time that night, fear wrapped around Ronald's chest. Not the fear of danger, but the fear of what he had just done. The weight of it settled in his stomach like a stone. His hands trembled at his sides, his fists still clenched, his body frozen between instinct and consequence. The air around them felt different now, charged with something heavier than anger. Then she spoke again, and this time her voice carried something deeper, a warning, a certainty. He was going to regret this. His breath caught as she reached into her coat pocket. His training took over, his fingers twitching toward his holster, adrenaline screaming at him to act. But before he could move, she pulled out something small and black. A wallet. With one fluid motion, she flipped it open, and the streetlight caught the metallic sheen of the badge inside. FBI. The ground beneath him seemed to shift. The authority he had wielded so confidently only moments ago vanished in an instant. The certainty he had always carried, the power he had never questioned, crumbled at his feet. He had just assaulted a federal agent, a woman he had assumed was nothing, a woman he had convinced himself was beneath him. His pulse pounded in his ears. Panic crawled up his spine, suffocating, inescapable. He had spent years believing he controlled this city, that his word was law. But now, standing in the dim glow of the streetlights, facing the woman he had underestimated, he felt something he never had before. Powerless. The night air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of what had just happened. The small shining badge in Helen's hand might as well have been a gavel, delivering a final, undeniable verdict. Ronald stood frozen, his confidence stripped away layer by layer under her unwavering gaze. She didn't need to say anything else. The silence between them spoke louder than any words ever could. His body finally responded, forcing a step backward as if trying to distance himself from the truth she had just revealed. His mind scrambled for a way out, any possible excuse that could soften the blow. Maybe he could twist it, say it was a misunderstanding, an unfortunate accident, but deep down, he knew better. There was no version of this that didn't end with consequences. He tried to steady his breathing, tried to salvage the crumbling illusion of control. But when he finally found his voice, it was shaky, unfamiliar. He attempted an explanation, but Helen cut through his words before they could even fully form. The pointed calmness in her voice made it clear that there was nothing he could say that she hadn't heard before. The moment he saw her, he had already decided what kind of person she was. And now he was standing face to face with the cost of that judgment. The power shift between them was undeniable. Though she was smaller, she loomed over him now, her presence filling the space with an authority he had spent his entire career believing was solely his to command. She laid out the truth in a way that left no room for argument. He had seen an older black woman, alone at night, and he had assumed the worst. He had let his prejudice speak before reason could. And now, his career, his entire future, was slipping through his fingers faster than he could grasp it. His chest tightened as he tried to piece together an apology, something, anything that might make a difference. But when the words came, they were weak, hollow, meaningless even to his own ears. He didn't mean for it to go this far. He had just lost control. But Helen wasn't impressed. She had heard those excuses before. People like him always claimed it wasn't their intention, only when they were caught. Ronald sat frozen, staring at his hands as the weight of Helen's words settled over him like a heavy fog. His career, his reputation, everything he had built over the years had unraveled in a single reckless moment. The silence in the room stretched uncomfortably, each second feeling like an eternity. He had spent years convincing himself that he was in control, that his instincts were always right. But now those same instincts had led him straight to his downfall. Helen remained composed, her gaze steady, waiting for him to acknowledge the truth he had spent years ignoring. The FBI agent beside her didn't speak, simply observing Ronald, as if measuring the depth of his regret. But what good was regret now? It wouldn't erase what he had done. It wouldn't change the fact that he had let his prejudice dictate his actions. His mind raced through possibilities. Would he lose his badge, his freedom? Would this make the news? The thought of his face plastered across headlines, "Officer assaults FBI agent in racially charged incident," made his stomach twist. He knew how these stories played out. He had seen other officers fall, their names dragged through the mud, their lives forever changed. He had never imagined he would be one of them. Helen exhaled slowly, then leaned back in her chair. "Tell me, Officer Green, what would have happened if I hadn't been FBI?" Her voice was quiet, almost too calm. What if I had just been another black woman on the street that night? Ronald's mouth felt dry, his throat tightening. He knew the answer, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. He had seen it before. Situations like this, where no badge was flashed, no higher authority stepped in. He had seen how they ended. Helen didn't press him for an answer. Instead, she reached into her pocket and slid a folder across the table. Ronald hesitated before looking at it, but when he did, his stomach dropped. Inside were pages of reports, complaints, filed against him over the years. Small incidents, moments of unnecessary aggression, times where he had pushed the boundaries of his authority, always against people who looked like Helen. None had been enough to end his career on their own. But now, together, they painted a damning picture. "This isn't just about tonight," Helen said, her voice edged with something deeper than frustration, disappointment. "This is about a pattern that ends now." Ronald swallowed hard. He had spent so long believing he was untouchable that his badge gave him the right to act as he pleased. But now, as he sat across from the very woman he had tried to intimidate, he realized the truth. The power he had wielded so carelessly was gone. And this time, there was no escaping the consequences. Ronald stared at the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly as he picked it up. He took a slow sip, letting the burn settle in his throat. But it did nothing to dull the storm in his mind. The bar was quiet, save for the low murmur of conversation and the occasional scrape of a chair against the worn wooden floor. No one paid him any attention, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly invisible. He had spent years commanding respect, no, demanding it. The badge on his chest had given him power, authority, a sense of control. But now, stripped of it, he was just another man at the bar, drinking away his regrets. Helen's words echoed in his mind. "This isn't about me, it's about you." She had seen right through him, seen the anger, the entitlement, the way he used his position not to serve but to dominate. He had spent so much time justifying his actions, telling himself he was doing what was necessary, that he was enforcing the law. But now, he had no illusions left. He had assaulted an innocent woman. Worse, he had done it because she hadn't played the role he expected. Ronald exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. The bartender, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, wiped down the counter and glanced at him. "You look like a man who's lost something important." Ronald let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah," he muttered, swirling his drink. "You could say that." The bartender didn't pry, just nodded and moved on to another customer, leaving Ronald alone with his thoughts. He had spent years believing in the system, believing that as long as he followed the rules, his rules, he was on the right side of things. But what if he had been wrong? What if the system he upheld wasn't as just as he thought? Helen had been right about one thing he hadn't thought. He had seen her and made assumptions the same way he had countless times before, but this time there had been consequences. Real ones. His career was over. His reputation was in shambles. And for the first time, Ronald Green had to sit with the weight of his own choices. The drink in his hand suddenly felt heavier, and he set it down, staring at the reflections in the worn wooden bar. Ronald gripped the glass tightly, swallowing the burning liquid in one quick motion, hoping it would silence the voice in his head. But the guilt remained, gnawing at him from the inside, reminding him of the irreversible line he had crossed. He ordered another drink, then another, but no amount of alcohol could change what had happened. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him with every breath. Just hours ago, he had walked these streets with authority, carrying the confidence of a man in control. Now everything looked different. The city, the streets, the people. Everything felt foreign through the lens of his downfall. His thoughts kept circling back to Helen Brooks, the way she had stood there unshaken, even after he struck her. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation in her stance. Her words echoed in his mind, words he couldn't ignore no matter how hard he tried. She had forced him to see something he had spent his entire career avoiding. He hadn't reacted to her as a person, but as a symbol of everything he had been conditioned to resist. He had judged her not on her actions, but on his own prejudices, ones he had never dared to acknowledge before. The realization was suffocating. The night air was cold against his skin as he left the bar, his feet carrying him through the empty streets without direction. He considered going home, but the thought of sitting in his apartment, alone with his thoughts, was unbearable. The city lights blurred in his vision, and every step felt heavier than the last. His career was over. His name would be dragged through the headlines, and he would forever be known as the officer who crossed the line. The justice system he had once served was now coming for him. The courthouse loomed in front of him, its massive doors standing as an unmovable force. Reporters filled the steps, cameras flashing, voices blending into an indistinct hum of accusations and judgment. His name was already tarnished, his future uncertain, but the worst part was knowing that no matter how much he tried to escape it, the truth was there, staring back at him. This was never about one mistake, it was about everything that had led him to this moment. And now, there was no turning back. The courtroom was cold and sterile, a place where lives were dissected and decisions were made without emotion. Ronald sat at the defense table, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his body stiff with the weight of what was coming. Across the room, Helen Brooks sat with the prosecution, her face unreadable. He couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze for more than a fleeting second. The guilt pressed against his ribs, making it hard to breathe. The hearing was brief, nothing more than legal formalities. The judge set bail, the trial date was scheduled, and before Ronald could even process what was happening, it was over. He felt detached, as if watching it all from a distance, like it wasn't real. But it was. His life was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he stepped out of the courtroom, his lawyer walked beside him, his voice low but firm. A plea deal was the best option, a reduced charge, a lighter sentence. Ronald barely nodded, his mind too numb to resist. This wasn't the future he had envisioned for himself, but none of this was supposed to happen. Weeks passed in a blur of discussions, paperwork, and endless negotiations. Eventually the deal was finalized. He would plead guilty. It was the only way forward. The day of his sentencing, Ronald stood before the judge, his heart pounding like a drum against his chest. The courtroom was packed with reporters, their pens scratching against paper, their cameras flashing, immortalizing his downfall. In the front row, Helen Brooks sat silently, watching. He didn't know what she was thinking, but her presence alone was enough to remind him of why he was here. The judge's voice rang out, clear and final. 6 months in prison, followed by probation. It could have been worse. It should have been worse, but even this felt like the end of everything. As he was led away in handcuffs, his eyes met Helen's one last time. She didn't speak, but her face said everything. She had warned him. His actions had consequences, and now he was drowning in them. Prison was a slow, suffocating sentence. The walls of his cell closed in around him, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He had nothing but time to think, to reflect, to face the truth he had spent years ignoring. Every night he replayed that moment over and over. If he had just stopped. If he had treated Helen with the respect she deserved. If he had let go of the prejudice that had clouded his judgment, none of this would have happened. His career, his reputation, his freedom gone because of a single moment of weakness. When he was finally released, the world had moved on. But he hadn't. The weight of his past followed him like a shadow, a constant reminder of the damage he had done. He couldn't undo what had happened. He couldn't erase the harm he had caused. But as he walked out of those prison gates, he made himself a promise. He would never let his prejudice blind him again.